Picking up where I left off, Chapter 5 from Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment, Volume 1 by Jane Roberts. The Garden of Eden. So this is part 2. Alright, first of all, Seth is about to reference an eye episode that Rob, Jane's husband, had. What happened is his vision actually improved. Seth talks about how you can improve your vision and your health in all different ways, and Rob's vision improves. He says that he got a 20/30 on the combined Snellen test score. He says, a few remarks on the eye episode. You were presented, or rather you presented yourself, with a prime example of the abilities of the natural person. I said something once to the effect that so-called miracles were simply the result of nature unimpeded, and certainly that is the case. You are presented now in the world with a certain picture of a body and its activities, and that picture seems very evidential. It seems to speak for itself. Instead, you are presented, of course, with a picture of man's body as it reflects and is affected by man's beliefs. Doctors expect vision to begin to fail, for example, after the age of 30, and there are countless patient records that prove that such disintegration is indeed a biological fact. Your beliefs tell you again that the body is primarily a mechanism, a most amazing machine, but a machine without its own purpose, without any intent, a mindless assembly plant of assorted parts that simply happen to grow together in a certain prescribed fashion. Science says that there is no will, yet it assigns to nature the will to survive, or rather a willless instinct to survive. To that extent, it does admit that the machine of the body intends to ensure its own survival. But a survival which has no meaning beyond itself, and because the body is a machine, it is expected to decay after so much usage. In that picture, consciousness has little part to play. In man's very early history, however, and in your terms for centuries after the awakening, as described in our book, people lived in good health for much longer periods of time, and in certain cases they lived for several centuries. No one had yet told them that this was impossible, for one thing. Their sense of wonder in the world, their sense of curiosity, creativity, and the vast areas of fresh mental and physical exploration kept them alive and strong. For one thing, however, elders were highly necessary and respected for the information they had acquired about the world. They were needed. They taught the other generations. In those times, great age was a position of honor that brought along with it new responsibility and activity. The senses did not fade in their effectiveness, and it is quite possible biologically for all kinds of regenerations of that nature to occur. To Rob, you spoke today or this evening about some world statesmen who are not young at all, and men and women who do not only achieve, but who open new horizons in their later years. They do so because of their private capacities, and also because they are answering the world's needs, and in ways that in many cases a younger person could not. In your society, age has almost been considered a dishonorable state. Beliefs about the dishonor of age often cause people to make the decision, sometimes quite consciously, to bring their own lives to an end before the so-called threshold is reached. Whenever the species needs the accumulated experience of its own older members, that situation is almost instantly reversed and people live longer. Some in your society feel that the young are kept out of life's mainstream also, denied purposeful work, their adolescence prolonged unnecessarily. As a consequence, some young people die for the same reason. They believe that the state of youth is somehow dishonorable. They are cajoled, petted, treated like amusing pets sometimes, diverted with technology's offerings, but not allowed to use their energy. There were many unfortunate misuses of the old system of having a son follow in his father's footsteps, yet the son at a young age was given meaningful work to do and felt a part of life's mainstream. He was needed. The so-called youth culture, for all of its seeming exaggerations of youth's beauty and accomplishments, actually ended up putting down youth, for few could live up to that picture. Often then both the young and the old felt left out of your culture. Both share also the possibility of accelerated creative vitality, activity that the elder great artists or the elder great statesmen have always picked up and used to magnify their own abilities. There comes a time when the experience of the person in the world click together and form a new, clearer focus, provide a new psychological framework from which his or her greatest capacities can emerge to form a new synthesis. But in your society, many people never reach that point, or those who do are not recognized for their achievements in the proper way or for the proper reasons. Man's will to survive includes a sense of meaning and purpose, and a feeling for the quality of life. You are indeed presented with an evidential picture that seems to suggest most vividly the fact of man's steady deterioration, and yet you are also presented with evidence to the contrary, even in your world, if you look for it. Your Olympics on television present you with evidence of the great capacity of the young human body. The contrast between the activity of those athletes, however, and the activity of the normal young person is drastic. You believe that the greatest training and discipline must be used to bring about such activity, but that seemingly extraordinary physical ability simply represents the inherent capacities of the human body. In those cases, the athletes, through training, are finally able to give a glimpse of the body's spontaneous abilities. The training is necessary because it is believed necessary. Again, in our material on suffering, I mentioned that illness serves purposes, and that it has a face-saving quality in your society. So here I am speaking of the body's own abilities. In that light, the senses do not fade. Age alone never brought about any loss of physical agility, or of mental ability, or of desire. Death must come to every living person, yet the time and the means are basically up to each individual. Meaningful work is important at any age. You cannot content the aged entirely with hobbies any more than you can the young, but meaningful work means work that also has the exuberance of play, and it is that playful quality that contains within itself great propensities of a healing and creative nature. In a fashion now, your eyes improve their capacities, practically speaking, in a playful manner. The senses want to exceed themselves. They also learn through experience. You have been painting more lately. Your eyes became more involved to that extent. Your eyes enjoy their part in that activity, as the ears say enjoy hearing. It is their purpose. Your own desire to paint joined with and reinforced your eyes' natural desire to see. When most of you think of your physical symptoms, you regard your body with a deadly seriousness that to some extent impedes your inner spontaneity. You lay your limiting beliefs upon that natural person. Up here, Rob's talking about the Bible and how long it says that people lived in the biblical era. And Seth comments, it's noted here that this is from a private session. Seth says, first, in those early days, men and women did live to ages that would amaze you today, many living to be several hundred years old. This was indeed due to the fact that their knowledge was desperately needed, and their experience. They were held in veneration, and they cast their knowledge into songs and stories that were memorized throughout the years. Besides this, however, their energy was utilized in a different fashion than yours is. They alternated between the waking and dream states, and while asleep they did not age as quickly. Their bodily processes slowed. Although this was true, their dreaming mental processes did not slow down. There was a much greater communication in the dream state, so that some lessons were taught during dreams, while others were taught in the waking condition. There was a greater and greater body of knowledge to be transmitted as physical evidence continued, for they did not transmit private knowledge only, but the entire body of knowledge that belonged to the groups as a whole. Okay, and then second, he says, the Bible is a conglomeration of parables and stories, intermixed with some unclear memories of much earlier times. The Bible that you recognize, or that is recognized, is not the first, however, but was compiled from several earlier ones as man tried to look back, so to speak, recount his past and predict his future. Such Bibles existed, not written down but carried orally, as mentioned some time ago by the speakers. It was only much later that this information was written down, and by then, of course, much had been forgotten. This is apart from the fact of tampering or downright misinformation, as various factions use the material for their own ends. The world, as you know it, exists as it does because you are yourselves a living portion of a vast, conscious grid of perception. Every cell in those terms is a sender and a receiver. All of the larger divisions of life, the mammals, fish, birds, and so forth, are an integral part of that living gridwork. The picture of the world is not only the result of those messages transmitted and received, however, but is also caused by the relationships between those messages. In your terms, then, all of life's large classifications were present at the beginning of the world. Otherwise, there would have been vast holes in that grid of perception that makes possible the very sensations of physical life. In a manner of speaking, the physical universe is transposed upon another reality that must be its source. The world was and is created in dimensions outside of time and outside of space as you understand it. Other realities quite as legitimate as your own, quite as vital, quite as real, coexist with your own, and in the terms of your understanding, in the same space. But of course, in terms of your experience, those spaces and realities would appear to be quite separate. No systems are closed, however, so that basically the living grid of perception that causes one world or reality is also wired into all other such systems. There is a give and take between them. The grids of perception that compose your world give you the world picture as you experience it, because your physical senses put you in a certain position within the entire grid. Animals, for example, while part of your experience, are also tuned into that grid at another level. The large classifications of mammals, fish, birds, men, reptiles, plants, and so forth are each an integral part of that larger perceptive pattern, and that pattern in those terms had to be complete even in the beginning of your time. In various periods, that gridwork might carry more traffic along certain circuits than at other periods, so that there has been some creative leeway allowed, particularly on the part of the species that make up your larger classifications. There were always birds, for example, but in the great interplay of interior and exterior communication among all portions of this vast living system, there was a creative interplay that allowed for endless variations within that classification and each other one. Your technological communication system is a conscious construct, a magnificent one, but one that is based upon your innate knowledge of the intercellular communication between all species. saying that I'm not robbing the intellect of its right to congratulate itself upon that technology. The large classifications of life give you the patterns into which consciousness forms itself, and because those patterns seem relatively stable, it is easy to miss the fact that they are filled out, so to speak, in each moment with new energy. Man does not in his physical development pass through the stages supposedly followed by the hypothetical creature who left the water for the land to become a mammal. But each species does indeed have, written within it, the knowledge of its past. Parts of this, again, is most difficult to express, and I must try to fill out old words with new meanings. The reincarnational aspects of physical life serve as a very important purpose, providing an inner subjective background. Such a background is needed by every species. Reincarnation exists, then, on the part of all species. Once a consciousness has chosen the larger classification of its physical existences, it stays within that framework in its reincarnational existences. Mammals return as mammals, for example, but the species can change within that classification. This provides great genetic strength, and consciousnesses in those classifications have chosen them because of their own propensities and purposes. The animals, for example, seem to have a limited range of physical activity in conscious terms as you think of them. An animal cannot decide to read a newspaper. Newspapers are outside of its reality. Animals have a much wider range, practically speaking, in certain other areas. They are much more intimately aware of their environment, of themselves as separate from it, but also of themselves as part of it. In that regard, their experience deals with relationships of another kind. These grids of perception do not exist forever in your dimension of time, for your dimension of time cannot hold anything that is outside of it. Once a world exists, however, it becomes imprinted or stamped upon eternity, so that it exists in time and out of it at once. When you ask, when did the world begin, or what really happened, or was there a Garden of Eden, you are referring to the world as you understand it. But in those terms, there were earths in the same space before the earth you recognize existed, and they began in the manner that I have given you in the early chapters of this book. The patterns for the world, the patterns, continue in your time dimension, though in that time dimension those worlds must disappear again to continue their existence outside of time. The patterns are filled out again. In the case of Earth, the grid of perception is simply used differently. Certain areas becoming prominent in some eras and less prominent in others. Using your idea of time, I can only say that when the entire gestalt of consciousnesses that formed a particular earth have formed its reality to the best of their abilities, fulfilling their individual and mass capacities as far as possible, then they lovingly turn over that grid to others and continue to take part in existences that are not physical in your terms, and that has happened many times. Your tale about the Garden of Eden, then, is a legend about Earth's last beginning. Each world is so cunningly constructed, again, that each consciousness, regardless of its degree, plays a vital part. And each of your actions, however inconsequential, becomes connected in one way or another, to each other reality and each other world. Now, in a manner of speaking, though I see that little time has passed in this living room where I speak with Rupert's permission, we have transcended time to some extent this evening. For in what I have said there are indeed hints and allusions, cadences that can, if you are ready, can give you a feeling for existence as it is outside of time's context. Even to try and verbally present such material necessitates alterations involving perception, For a while, that gridwork appears quite stable to your senses, giving you a reliable picture of reality. This is also because you have trained yourselves to pick up certain signals only. Others at other levels are available. You can tune in to cellular consciousness, for example. Since this material must be comprehensible, Rupert and I together form our own pathway of perceptions, he from his end and me from mine, so that we thread back and forth as if through the wiring of some vast computer, but a computer that is alive. The value climate of psychological reality is Seth's attempt at originating a better word for the word plane, material on fragments. Seth says, in some submerged manner, all fragments of a personality exist within an entity with their own individual consciousnesses. They are not aware of the entity itself. The entity operates its fragments in what you would call a subconscious manner, that is, without conscious direction. The entity gives the fragments independent life, then more or less forgets them. Even thoughts, for instance, are fragments, though on a different plane. Fragments of another sort, called personality fragments, operate independently, though under the auspices of the entity. The emergence of action within a time scheme is actually one of the most important developments connected with the beginning of your world. The Garden of Eden story, in its most basic sense, refers to man's sudden realization that now he must act within time. His experiences must be neurologically structured. This immediately brought about the importance of choosing between one action and another, and made acts of decision highly important. This time reference is perhaps the most important within Earth experience, and the one that most influences all creatures. In experience or existence outside of time, there is no necessity to make certain kinds of judgments. In an out-of-time reference, theoretically speaking now, an infinite number of directions can be followed at once. Earth's time reference, however, brought to experience a new brilliant focus, and in the press of time, again, certain activities would be relatively more necessary than others, relatively more pleasant or unpleasant than others. Among a larger variety of possible actions, man was suddenly faced with a need to make choices that, within that context, had not been made before. Speaking in terms of your time, early man still had a greater neurological leeway. There were alternate neurological pathways that, practically speaking, were more available then than now. They still exist now, but they have become like ghostly signals in the background of neurological activity. This is again difficult to explain, but free will operates in all units of consciousness regardless of their degree, but it operates within the framework of that degree. Man possesses free will, but that free will operates only within man's degree. That is, his free will is somewhat contained by the frameworks of time and space. He has free will to make any decisions that he is able to make. This means that his free will is contained, given meaning, focused and framed by his neurological structure. He can only move, and he can only choose, therefore, to move, physically speaking, in certain directions in space and time. That time reference, however, gives his free will meaning and a context in which to operate. We are speaking now of conscious decisions as you think of them. You can only make so many conscious decisions, or you would be swamped and caught in a constant dilemma of decision-making. Time organizes the available choices that are to be made. The awakening mentioned earlier then found man rousing from his initial dreaming condition, faced suddenly with the need for action in a world of space and time, a world in which choices became inevitable, a world in which he must choose among probable actions, and from an infinite variety of those choose which events he would physically actualize. This would be an almost impossible situation were the species, meaning each species, not given its own avenues of expression and activity, so that it is easier for certain species to behave in certain manners. And each species has its own overall characteristics and propensities that further help it define the sphere of influence in which it will exert its ability to make choices. Each species is endowed also by virtue of the units of consciousness that compose it with an overall inner picture of the condition of each other species, and further characterized by basic impulses, so that it is guided toward choices that best fulfill its own potentials for development, while adding to the overall good of the entire world consciousness. This does not curtail free will any more than man's free will is curtailed, because he must grow from a fetus into an adult instead of the other way around. The differences among all species are caused by this kind of organization, so that areas of choice are clearly drawn, and areas of free activity clearly specified. The entire gestalt of probable actions, therefore, is already focused to some degree in species differentiations. In the vast structure of probable activity, however, far more differentiation was still necessary, and this is provided for through the inner passageways of reincarnational existence. Each person, for example, is born with his or her uniquely individual set of characteristics and abilities, likes and dislikes. Those serve to organize individual action in a world where an infinite number of probable roads are open. And here again, private impulses are basically meant to guide each individual toward avenues of expression and probable activities best suited to his or her development. They are meant, therefore, as aids to help organize action and to set free will more effectively into motion. Otherwise, free will would be almost inoperable in practical terms. Individuals would be faced by so many choices that any decision would be nearly impossible. Essentially, the individual would have no particular leaning toward any one action over any other. By the time that the Garden of Eden tale reached your biblical stories, the entire picture had already been seen in the light of concepts about good and evil that actually appeared in those terms a long time later in man's development. The inner reincarnational structure of the human psyche is very important in man's physical survival. Infants dream of their past lives, remembering, for example, how to walk and talk. They are born with the knowledge of how to think, with the propensity for language. They are guided by memories that they later forget. In time's reference, the private purposes of each individual appear also in the larger historical context, so that each person forms his corner of his civilization, and all individuals within a given time period have private and overall purposes, challenges that are set, probable actions that they will try to place within history's context. So that is the end of Chapter 5, the Garden of Eden. And the next chapter is Chapter 6, Genetic Heritage and Reincarnational Predilections. All of these chapters are really great, so if you want to hear them all, go to my Seth Speaks channel and listen to the whole book.